to be popular, Governor, but it's right. We're going to manage the fish way better than we have been managing it the last century. We could choose to be popular and do it the way you described, or we could choose to be unpopular and make it work. And we chose the latter course. And some people believed it, most people didn't, but we came to believe in each other. And by the way, it's 40 years later and it's still in play.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Welcome, Bill, or if it's okay, maybe you prefer to be called Wilk. I'm not sure.
Either one.
Either one.
Yeah.
It's really a pleasure to meet you. I've read so much about you recently and read so much by you at your new book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's certainly a fascinating story and history that all parties have been through in Washington State over the last 50 years. And one of the things I was really hoping you could do for us to start off is give our listeners who are sort of unfamiliar with the historical fisheries conflict in Washington State or the Boldt decision, if you could just help us visualize or explain how bad it really got there in those early days. And after doing all the reading I could consume over the last 2 months, it really sounded as bad as possible. And the fact that now today we've come out of it with a co-management system in place, I think there is, it offers hope from what I could tell. But I think it's good to give people a sense of where things were in the beginning in Washington.
Well, my life in the business started in the mid 70s after the Boldt decision, which I'm sure we'll talk quite a lot. But the history between the settlers and the tribes, of course, went back a century and a half. Even before Washington became a state was when the treaties that were the subject of the Boldt decision were signed. Those treaties were signed in the 1850s. And from that point forward, tribes were moved to reservation areas and ceded properties by the territorial government. And a key provision of the treaty was that the tribes would maintain their rights to fish in common with the citizens of the territory/state over the years. When canneries started forming along many of the rivers in our state, the salmon became a huge economic resource, as did shellfish and other species. So that provision, which was kind of probably to the negotiators, wasn't all that significant, became a hugely significant thing because the fish started being heavily harvested by both non-Indian and tribal fishers through the early 1900s and then into 2000. So the fish became a valuable resource. Fisheries was one of the top 3 or 4 industries in the state throughout the 20th century. And as you might guess, the share of harvest became dominant by the non-Indian fleets. And the tribes found themselves in a situation where they had to fight to get virtually any share of the harvest. When Judge Boldt held his famous hearings in the early 70s, which led to his decision. The relative portion of harvest was about 97 for the non-Indian fleets and 3% arriving on tribal, usual, and accustomed areas. So hostilities existed long before the Boldt decision, as the resource became contested, I guess is the way to put it. One of the great characters in my book is Billy Frank Jr. Billy was first arrested for fishing at, quote, out of season when he was 14 years old. And he was arrested by the state I think it was 37 times over the years, as he claimed to be pursuing his treaty rights, and the state claiming that, no, your fishery is closed for conservation purposes. And one of the reasons the tribes, for the most part, did their fishing in the rivers when the fish returned to their rivers to spawn. And we have 19 treaty tribes in Western Washington. And let's just say the state kept shutting them down as fish managers for conservation purposes. And the tribes, in defiance, often continued to fish. Hard way to manage the resource, and not much shame on the part of the non-Indian industry, who had their way for probably 60, 70 years in terms of fishing. And like I said, a very large industry had formed. We had canneries. There were, I think, 48 canneries just on the lower part of the Columbia River itself. And there were canneries all around Puget Sound, which is where I live and where Billy Frank lived. So bottom line, there was a lot of hostility, a lot of rests, a lot of protest fishing going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of defiance, a lot of lawsuits, and some successful from a tribal standpoint, some not. But the biggest lawsuit that occurred was the Boldt decision. And Judge Boldt made the determination that the language in the treaties, in common with, meant that what was now 90% dominated by the non-Indian fishers needed to get cut back to 50%. And to say that that was not well received by the non-Indian community, by the political community, et cetera, would be an understatement. There was huge protest fishing going on, total chaos in our waters. I still was in Washington, D.C. at the time, so I was not around for the decision itself. I was not involved in the litigation in any way. But I was kind of an interested bystander because it was national news when Judge Boldt made that decision. And of course, then the state and my predecessors at the Fisheries Department were in a situation where they'd go into federal court one day and be told to open the fishery so that the tribes could get their share. And then they were told by the state courts at that time, no, you can't do it. It's on appeal. It's not the law. It's not, we're going to overturn it and so forth. And so the politics from 74 to 79, and when I started becoming involved, was just plain ugly. In fact, the Court of Appeals on the Boldt decision, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in our government, called it the most chaotic, racially sensitive situation since Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated the schools in the South. And if you're familiar with that, that was rather famous series of years and years and years of protest. Well, we were facing exactly the same circumstance in Washington State. So that's a thumbnail, Jamie. You certainly are free to ask any more detailed questions, but that's my best effort to kind of describe the early situation. But it was very chaotic. It was politically deeply sensitive on both sides, and at some point, somebody was going to have to fix it.
Yeah, I was just recently, I was listening to a podcast. The Town Hall Seattle has a civic series. I'm not sure if you listened to that or not,
I
but
do.
they had a panel session on Boldt at 50, and there was an elder, Nancy Shippentauer, who was on the stage, and she wasn't holding no punches back and telling what her experiences were like.
Nancy was a one-of-a-kind leader, I can tell you that.
Oh, you know her?
I don't know her well, but I certainly have dealt with her over the years, and she was a great leader and a great friend of Billy Frank's.
Yeah, one of the things that she said that completely tipped everything over in my head was because everybody was celebrating the Boldt decision, and in that town hall, she was very succinct and to the point, and quite disappointed that Judge Boldt gave away 50% of the tribe's fish. So it got a little bit of laughter out of the crowd, but I got no doubt there was a lot of seriousness behind her comment, and it was a different way of looking at it. But yeah, she did also give a lot of raw testimony about what some of those conflicts were like. And a part of your book that sticks out in my mind as well is the story that you share about coming home to Washington to a private party, and there's a man and his wife. He's got a bow tie on, and nobody really wants to come and socialize with him. And turns out this was Judge Boldt. And after the decision that was made, and sounds like he was certainly being ostracized after the fact, and must have went through some hard times there as well.
Well, he was. There were, in front of his courtroom in Tacoma, Washington, there were massive protest marches. He was hung in effigy all over the state, particularly in fishing communities. He was lambasted by politicians. And that was the only time I met him. I actually went to his courtroom a couple of times just as an observer, but I did not chat with him or anything during that period of time. I met him that one time, and he was just a classy human being. And so was his wife. So we had a really special time. But I knew nothing at that time about. In fact, I kind of barely heard his name, and I probably talked to him for a half hour because he wanted to talk to me. I was just returning from D.C., and he had quite a series of D.C. experiences in his lifetime. And so he was advising me on how to take advantage of what I had learned in D.C. and represent clients out here that had needs in the DC situation. So it was a delightful evening, but afterwards, my father-in-law was just embarrassed that no one would talk to him other than his son-in-law and his daughter, and it was embarrassing. It really was embarrassing to him and to the family. But that's the way it was. I mean, it was real. I guess I'd call it the animosity was overwhelming.
I can't imagine the fortitude he must have had and the resilience to make sure that decision did eventually continue to be or start to be implemented. That's one of the things that's really hard to get your mind around when you're reading about this story is and your inside perspective would be invaluable, but just the narratives of how the state of Washington was unwilling to implement the decision. And that had to have been challenging for someone like yourself when you came along to the fisheries department. I'm not sure how you'd deal with a situation like that, but you certainly had a fundamental different outlook on how things needed to be done.
Well, by the time I got there, which was in early 1980, the Supreme Court of the United States had affirmed about 90 to 95% of the Boldt decision. And all the critical issues were pretty much decided in favor of the tribal interests by the U.S. Supreme Court. So when I came in as deputy director of the agency, and my boss, Raleigh Schmitten, was a state legislator who was appointed by the new governor, John Spellman, to be the fisheries director. And Raleigh and I came in, the agency was just starting to really, truly grapple with how to get this decision implemented with the least amount of turmoil possible. And because until the Supreme Court did render its decision, it was just total chaos. I mean, in fact, the court was basically managing the fishery during that time because the state was prohibited by its Supreme Court to not implement the decision. It wasn't the choice of the fisheries director. It was all controlled by the courts. And of course, there was almost no political support in the state legislature at that time for the Boldt decision. So the two previous fisheries directors, Don Moose and Gordon Sanderson, are major friends of mine and Raleigh's. And so we were kind of the first that even had any license to try to implement it. And now we had a U.S. Supreme Court order to implement it, and that trumped anything that the state courts could say or do. And so we were really the first two directors that had a clear requirement and an order to basically fulfill. The ones before us and the agency people that were involved in implementing or not implementing the decision really did not have any clear authority to do that. We did. And so we had to figure out how we were going to do it.
I'd like to back up a little bit, though, too. We should tell listeners a bit about who you are, too, and your positionality and what makes Bill Wilkerson who he is, because one of the things that sticks out to me is that you were obviously motivated to change the tide, and even with those new decisions and the mandate, I would argue that it still would have been easier for some to stay the course and stay entrenched in conflict. But you didn't. I'm just kind of wondering a bit more about your background and kind of how you were led to see this so much fundamentally different, basically.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm an attorney. I had been in Washington, D.C. for the bulk of the debate until 1976. I came out and I was doing a couple of projects with the federal government and the state. And I actually met two of the leaders in the Department of Fisheries, Frank Ha and Dr. Peter Bergman, who ran the salmon program. And Frank was the deputy director under both Don Moose and Gordon Sanderson. And they became good friends of mine. They actually taught me how to fish. We had opportunities to work on a couple of small projects together. And I just fell in love with the whole fisheries management situation. I remember going home and telling my ex-wife that I think I finally found my place, because Frank and Pete were teaching me. They were showing me how complicated it was to manage salmon, a migratory fish up and down the coasts, the Pacific coast and so forth. And it just stole my heart, I guess is the way to put it, in the late 70s. By 1980, a new governor came in, John Spellman. He was what I'd call a moderate Republican, and I did not know him. But because of some of the work that we were doing in the 70s, Frank and Pete truly believed that we needed to greatly enhance the resource to lessen the burden and the economic burden on both non-Indian and create even greater opportunities for the tribal fishing fleet as it was growing and evolving during that time. So I had kind of gotten the bug. And then in 1981, after the election, Spellman appointed Raleigh Schmitten to be the fisheries director. And Raleigh immediately called me and asked me to be the deputy director. Well, I was in a really awkward place there because my good friend Frank was going to be the deputy. And he said, I have plans for Frank. I want him to head up our sport fishery and our enhancement programs. I want Pete to stay, but I have to replace him. And he said he would be talking to Frank and Pete that later that day, as a matter of fact, after he met with me. And I said, well, I'm not going to say yes until I hear their response. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a call from Frank, and he basically said, Wilk, I think I want you to take this job. I know you're feeling awkward. Raleigh's told me what is possible in the new administration. I accept that. And I would really like it if you would take the job. And that's how I became deputy director. And at that point, I really realized how little I really knew about fisheries. And so I was really humbled by the opportunity. It was, I was making a lot more money as a lawyer, but I was not doing what I loved as a lawyer most of the time. So I took the job, and then Raleigh had been chairman of the Natural Resources Committee in the House of Representatives. So he had a pretty good background, but we really were two young bucks. He was 37, I was 35 at the time, and I knew we had to implement the decision. So the question was, how are we going to go about doing that? My head and my heart told me that pretty early on that allowing the court to continue to manage the fishery was the first thing that we needed to put an end to. And that was going to be no easy task because the court had exercised continuing jurisdiction because of the conflicting state Supreme Court decision in 1977. And by that time, basically, it was lawyers and the judge and his court advisor were running the fishery in the state. We gave them the data. We argued our points. The tribes came in and gave them their data, argued their points. And then the judge as referee would make the final decision as to what season was going to be set or what fishery was going to be opened or closed, keeping in mind that you were going to have to meet the 50-50 target sometime pretty soon. So that's how I became involved, and I was in a great position to at least explore alternative policies to the ones that we had been governed by over the years. And of course, that was kind of my background. So Raleigh gave me a pretty free hand to get involved in certain aspects of that. And then Raleigh took a huge interest in the whole subject matter. He was a great fisherman and fascinated by the whole conflict as a politician. But I think the two of us kind of fell in love with the whole thing for the same reasons, and we became partners for the next 5 or 6 years. So That's how we got involved.
Yeah, and congratulations for putting the judge out of business in Arizona. That was work well done, and to see the tribes and the state starting to have dialogue and make decisions so that things weren't having to go to a judge every season was certainly nice to read about. And I know in the co-management academic literature, there's a lot written and said about Western science and indigenous science and so on. And one of the things that really jumped out at me in your book as well is the different times you had to deal with the bad behavior, I'll say, of the governmental scientists and different tactics that sector were using to avoid having to work with the tribal organizations. And I'm really interested in your reflections on that and how you were able to counteract that, because usually the scientific community and fisheries departments and unions involved, they're used to and accustomed to a lot of influence, but you had to step in there at different points and sort of level the playing field. I'm really curious how you decided how you were going to tackle that, I guess, and things that you did that were effective.
Well, we knew coming into the job that we had to implement the decision. Okay. So that was the first. So when you know you have to do something as a matter of law, I don't think either Raleigh or I needed to be persuaded by anyone that some different approaches needed to be taken. I kind of undersold this. I got to meet Billy Frank during the late 70s, during that time when Frank and Pete were introducing me around and training me. And Billy Frank probably had more to do with co-management in Washington by a number, I'd say by 10, than any of the rest of us. And Billy Frank was the most charismatic, kind leader I've ever known. And I've known a lot of really good leaders and worked for some of them. So Billy was just building up the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission when I became involved in the mid-70s there. And Billy became chairman in 1977, I believe. And Billy could get along with people more than anybody I've ever known. And by getting along, that meant he could carry on a conversation with people. And Billy believed in two things. He believed that the salmon was absolutely critical to all of our lives. And he believed in his treaty rights. And like I said, he was arrested almost 40 times by the state in support of that latter belief. And once it became the law, Billy was just becoming probably one of the most important political leaders in the history of our state. And I don't want to just let that pass by. I want you to make sure your audience knows if there was a great man involved in all the changes that were going to take place in the 1980s, the number one such person was Billy Frank Jr. And Billy and I became friends. When Raleigh came in as fisheries director, he asked me to figure out how we could build a solid relationship with Billy Frank. And I went and met with Billy, and he said, well, I don't know Raleigh yet, but the fact that he hired you is a pretty good sign, and I want to get to know him. And we ended up having breakfast with Billy. We called it Breakfast with Billy, at least once a month, and probably on average once every maybe 3 weeks on Mondays at his roost at what they called the Hawks Prairie Inn. And we would have breakfast with Billy, and we got to know each other. And Raleigh came to feel the same way about Billy that I did. So we became friends, but we were friends with caution. The one rule that Billy and I shared with each other when I got there, I said, I'm never going to ask you to commit suicide, and I'm hoping you'll feel the same way about me. And by that, I'm not going to ask you to do politically impossible things. I'm not going to ask you to give up your treaty rights. I'm not going to ask you to stop talking about the need to enhance fish, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to do the same thing. I want to say the same things because we agree on. So what we did at those breakfasts, Jamie, was we actually started to see issues that we had in common with each other. And in common with is the title of my book. That really three most important words that could describe that era in my mind are in common with. And we found that we had a lot in common. We both wanted to enhance the resource. We wanted a treaty with Canada. We wanted peace on the waters. We wanted to manage the fish better than we were managing them, et cetera. So we had a lot that we were figuring out we had in common with each other. And the biggest one, quite frankly, was a Pacific Salmon Treaty. And Raleigh assigned me to become a kind of the lead negotiator on that treaty for the state. Pete Bergman had been representing us for years, and Pete wanted out. He thought it was a political issue, not a scientific issue, and he wanted to work on the science. And I loved it. I loved that thought. My dream had been to bring federal and state agencies together and have them working more as one unit, and U.S.-Canada required that. The U.S. really never had its act together up until then. And the one person who agreed with me on that most vehemently was Billy Frank. He wanted that treaty with Canada just as badly as Raleigh and I did. So again, we started to find things in common. Frank was, at that time, Frank Haw was working on a number of enhancement hatchery reform issues, and we got them together because Billy felt the same needed to happen in tribal hatcheries. And there were a number of tribal hatcheries around Puget Sound. So, we just started finding things where we could work together. We were still in that federal court process of quibbling over every little fish in every little stream. And we didn't have an idea how to fix that situation in the early 80s. But I'll never forget, I had a meeting in 83. We thought we had a treaty with Canada in 1983. It had been recommended by the lead U.S. negotiator and the lead Canadian negotiator. That fell apart largely on the U.S. side because we had not done our political homework satisfactorily because we'd been so busy negotiating the treaty. We hadn't gotten the kind of political consensus it needed. And so that treaty fell apart, much to the dismay of the Canadians, who had worked their butt off to get a salmon treaty with us. And we had our lead negotiators, Mike Shepard from Canada and Lee Alverson from the U.S., did their level best to kind of force feed us all into an agreement. Billy agreed. Raleigh and I agreed. I guess at that point I was director, but we got a general agreement from most of the fisheries entities, but we still couldn't get it through the Congress at that time. Right. So what we did, Billy and his counterpart in the Columbia River that ran the Intertribal Fish Commission down there, Tim Wapato, great man. The three of us got together after the treaty fell apart, and we decided that we needed to form a political coalition that would, get people back to the negotiating table, and B, if we were to receive a treaty, to become a force in the advocacy of that treaty, which we had not done in 1983. We had not organized the political coalition, and we all vowed not to make that mistake again. So slowly but surely, we were finding things that we could agree upon. All of them were difficult, all of them were complicated, but they were starting to come together. Raleigh became deputy chief of staff to Governor Spellman in early 1983, and then I got appointed as fisheries director in very early 83, and we kept moving on. Now I had gotten sort of close to Governor Spellman, but now his deputy chief of staff was my best friend and a total advocate for the fish. So we were suddenly quite strong in the governor's office. And I can't tell you how important that became. And we ended up back in negotiations in 84 with the Canadians. We had new leadership from both the prime minister and the president. And we got a treaty in early 1985 with the Canadians. Huge importance. And the reason it was important was it imposed a co-management system headed up by the Salmon Commission that was formed under the treaty. Okay. And it required us to co-manage the sources that were being intercepted by the other nation. It was called an interception treaty. And it really established a multi-nation co-management system. And as we were advocating for that, I can remember sitting in a room with Billy and Tim one afternoon. It was a downtime in the negotiations, and I looked at both of them and I said, why can't we be doing that? We're sitting here advocating for co-management with the Canadians and all of the interests up and down the Pacific coast. Why can't we manage our own fishery that way? And both of them kind of got smiles on their face. And Billy said to me, "Oh, William, you're up to something, you know." And I said, "You tell me, why can't we manage the resource together in Washington's fisheries? We do it on the Pacific coast with the federal agencies. We do it in the Columbia River with the state of Oregon. You guys have the resources to manage fish now that you didn't have in the 1970s. And we're still letting the court manage the fish. That doesn't make any sense to me." So that's how the dialogue started.
We have gotten a lot of feedback on the Co-Management Commons podcast, and one thing that we often hear is people wanting to have practical ideas on how to go forward after listening to some of these talks. So we have created a community of practice, and we invite you to check it out at www.comanagement.ca. And if you're interested in joining with other co-management allies in Canada that are meeting on a monthly basis, learning from expert guest speakers, and engaging in an online community, please check it out, and we would like to hear from you and would invite you to join us in this practical community of practice. Take care. Yeah, one of the things I'm really interested in just listening to the whole thread of stories is certainly the friendship and relationship that you did build with Billy Frank Jr. and certainly in the co-management, the literature and different experiences, everybody talks about how co-management is more about relationships amongst humans than it is trying to manage the fish. And I just wonder if there's more you can share on sort of ways that you guys became friends. I got no doubt a lot of breakfasts helped,
Yeah.
it sounded like, and bonding through a treaty exercise where you're on the same side
Yeah.
must have been amazing as well. But were there other sort of things that you were able to accomplish as director to solidify that relationship going forward? Did you fish together?
We had what we called a annual directors trip. Billy never came because Billy didn't drink, and the rest of us all drank, you know. But I hosted one. Tim Wapato often came. And so that was a little bit of it. We did some fishing with each other. Guy McMines, who was another great tribal leader, he was a guide on some of the coastal rivers in Washington. And Guy would take us fishing quite regularly. I fished a lot with other directors up and down the coast. But the real key was finding issues and problems to solve. Raleigh, while he was still director, we found out we were counting Chinook salmon wrong. Raleigh's first instinct was, we've got to go talk to Billy and tell him that we screwed up, because the error was, of course, favorable to the non-Indian fishers. And we had to find a way to make that up. Through our breakfasts, and we hired our friend Jim Waldo, who facilitated a lot of discussions on different issues. You'll see in my book, really key figure in making co-management work. And Jim helped us on that particular issue. We called it the Chinook allocation crisis. And we got that solved. So it was experience with each other, and then getting the first Pacific Salmon Treaty. We worked it out. I mean, we had hard negotiations on what we and the tribes were going to have to give up to get the Canadians in agreement. So I think the key to forming relationships was A, just the desire to communicate, and B, then finding problems to solve. And we built what we call the Chinook Management Plan for Puget Sound. That came to be in 1984. The parties had never agreed on basic principles on how to manage the resources. And then when we started the co-management pilot project in 1984, after the now famous Port Ludlow conference, we agreed to a pilot project where we would manage together through that summer all the commercial fisheries in Puget Sound. And it turned out later in the summer that we managed the coastal river fisheries through that process. We went to court 3 times that year, compared to 70 to 80 every year before that. And so we set up the pilot project, and by God, we made it work. Waldo facilitated all those meetings. And so we had a referee, which used to be the court, who facilitated the dialogue. We had the scientists presenting in front of us every day, and we had the policy leaders, myself and a couple of my salmon program leaders on one side, and Billy and his tribal leadership team on the other. And the policy leaders ultimately worked out the agreements with Waldo's help in 1984. We didn't announce it as co-management. We announced it as a pilot project. Co-management was too far, too fast, particularly for Billy and his people. They didn't trust us as far as they could throw it, but he persuaded them in giving it a try. And when we got through that summer, deciding these things by ourselves and with each other, sharing data, sharing information, etc., we knew we were onto something. And then we agreed to do that, not only in Washington waters the next year, but we also went to work with Tim Wapato on the Columbia River, and we got the tribes a much more significant role in the management of the ocean fishery off the Pacific coast, which was in federal waters. And so by the time of the 85 completed, we had done co-management for 2 years in Washington, 1 year on the Columbia, 1 year in the ocean, and now 1 year in with the Canadians in Alaska under the treaty. So co-management evolved through experience. And I will tell you, it was not popular, but it was right. And so we had a choice. The political choice that we made and that I presented to the governor every day is, it isn't going to be popular, Governor, but it's right. We're going to manage the fish way better than we have been managing it the last century. And some people believed it, most people didn't, but we came to believe in each other. And by the way, it's 40 years later and it's still in play. So I think we made the right call. I sent you a note last week that basically said we could choose to be popular and do it the way you described, or we could choose to be unpopular and make it work. And we chose the latter course. And not just me, Billy Frank, Tim Wapato, Jack Donaldson from Oregon, all sorts of people got on that. The federal fish managers, they all got on board.
It sounded like it was nice to have the political support to be unpopular, but do the right thing. We don't see that enough at times in our society, it feels like.
Particularly now, but we do see it. And both governors, I worked for two governors, a Republican and a Democrat, and both of them knew what the right thing was. And they both held firm. They got hung in effigy too, so did I, so did Billy. But we knew we were on the right course, and I think history tells us we were on the right course. So
there was so much that you shared there that I could see over time how that would have increasingly built more and more trust and coming clean, I guess, on that scientific error and finding a solution to it for allocations. I know when I read the book, I was thinking to myself, that had to have been a huge step. And it's really nice how you frame that of small steps and starting somewhere and then through experience. And there's no doubt it was, whether they were calling it adaptive co-management or not, that in the early stages, that sounds exactly what was happening. Yeah. And I'm really curious about Billy Frank Jr. I'm in the middle now of reading his sort of biography that was put together there by a local historical group in Washington State. And you've had so much personal time with him. I'm curious what you think made him such a successful negotiator and an advocate for co-management, because it was really insightful to think about at different parts in your book that he had to build consensus amongst the tribes and stuff as well. It sounded like there were a lot of strong leaders there that had to all come together on this. And I wondered about all of the work that he had to do to get everybody on the same page with so many different tribes. But any insights being on the other side of the negotiating table of how he was effective?
Well, first of all, I still have yet to meet a person who didn't like Billy Frank. So I think I said it earlier, he was a kind, fun, gentle man in one way, but he was tough as nails as well. So he commanded respect. He was, none of us ever knew how much education Billy had. But you couldn't fool him on anything. He knew the salmon, and he knew it better than I could ever know it, because he fished his whole life. He loved going down to his little set net area in the Nisqually River, and he would escape there. So he was truly a man of the river, and he just had a way with people. He got along with the environmental groups, and we negotiated quite a few over the years. We negotiated quite a few agreements between public utilities and timber companies and other interest groups, counties and state agencies, who had to work with Billy and didn't know how. And I made my living helping people work, not just with Billy, but with other key tribal leaders. He had 5 commissioners that he reported to as chairman of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission from 5 regions of the state: the Washington Coast, North Puget Sound, Central Puget Sound, and South Puget Sound, Hood Canal and Straits area, all the waterways that we manage fish in. And he built himself a very strong coalition of supporters. And he got along with tribal chairs. He was viewed as their equal. He got along with our 2 U.S. senators in 1980, and he used U.S. Canada, by the way, as a key vehicle to do that, and then ultimately co-management. But he had great relationships with Senator Magnuson and Senator Jackson. He had good relationships with a number of our congressional House of Representatives members, and he built personal relationships with those people. He had great relationship with the 2 governors that I worked for. And then after that, the governors in the state, they all wanted Billy on their friendship list, I guess is the way to put it. So Billy was a natural politician, and God only knows, but he was different because he so strongly believed in his 2 basic guiding principles. He believed in protecting the salmon. I don't know any politician who could disagree with that. And he believed in his treaty rights. And once you got past that, you had to learn how to deal with those realities. And like I said, we used our personal crises and experiences as fish managers. We just learned to do it together. And he was an easy guy to work with because he knew that his guys weren't 100% right. He sure as hell knew my scientists weren't 100% right. And he was just a great cheerleader in the sense that, come on, guys, we can do this. And he'd smile and kind of nod his head, and you wanted to do it when Billy Frank was in the room. That was just the truth. So what made him a great leader? Just who he was. That's what made him a great leader. And he was consistent until the day he died.
Yeah, he was clearly able to exist in 2 different worlds, whether it was on the river or in a boardroom or in an international negotiation.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I knew Billy, and I knew his wife, Sue Crystal. She was in the cabinet with me, and Willie Frank is somebody who did a testimony on my book, Willie the Third, and Willie is he's a stronger will than his father in some ways, but he's just as charismatic, and he's chairman of the Nisqually tribe right now, and he's going to make this stuff continue. I guess that's the way I'll put it. He believed in his father, and he believes he can do pretty much what his father did, and he can keep people working together. And he's got many of the qualities that his dad had, including a great enthusiasm for the fish and a great enthusiasm for treaty rights.
Yeah, that leads into a question that I wanted to ask you is, how do you feel the state of the union is now, and where do you think things are heading with co-management?
Well, I just spoke at the 50th anniversary celebration this year and talked about co-management. And there were two panels after my joint presentation with the current chairman of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, Ed. And so we kind of kicked off the discussion about all that had happened since Boldt. And the 50th anniversary was in a hotel the Muckleshoot tribe has built through their casino and bingo operations and so forth. And I was sitting outside waiting for my car to drive home after the presentation, and Jim Waldo had been in attendance at the conference, and I hadn't seen Jim in a while. And I said, "This is a little different, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah, it sure is." I said, "Remember all those hotels we negotiated in the 80s? Now they're negotiating in this beautiful facility, and they own it." So the first thing I saw at the conference, and it was a 2-day conference, was that things are way better today for the tribes in general, but the level of confidence that they carry to the table when it comes to co-management, they are a player. They're much more powerful than they were. They're recognized as more powerful than they were back in my days. And they have resources to be more powerful, and they are. So I think co-management's going to be around for years to come. I don't think it'll ever return to the crap that was going on in the 50s and 60s. Of course, I felt that way about civil rights, and I felt that way about, until you see the clown shows that are going on now, I felt that way about voting rights and so forth. So if anybody goes backwards, I don't think it's going to be the tribes. And so what is the state? I spoke at the 40th anniversary celebration too, and I think at the 30th. And the bonds are more natural now. They're used to working together. It's a given that they work together. They don't want it to be managed by the courts. Neither side wants that. And that would be the only alternative if you were to go backwards. So I don't think there's a likelihood that people are going to go backwards. And I think that they manage the fish better than they did. There's never going to be enough fish to satisfy either side. Never was, never will be. Even when they didn't have any regulation in the old days, they still had to close fisheries at some point, So that's never going to change. And hopefully the public commitment to fish habitat and to the fisheries resource itself will continue to grow. I think people are kind of taking it for granted now, which is very dangerous. But in terms of the quality of the people that are running the resources and handling the management, I think they're used to each other, and I think they do well working together. So I'm very positive about it.
One of the topic areas that we also talk a lot about in co-management is this bridging of knowledge systems. And one of the things I guess that sort of jumped out at me a little bit as I've been reading and educating myself about this experience is there's a lot of reference to, I guess, Western science, we could call it. And Judge Boldt himself even talked about the need for science and got his own advisor.
Yeah.
when he had to manage the fishery himself for a period of time. And I'm just wondering, is there more out there about the tribal knowledge and techniques and science that they would have for managing the fishery as well? And maybe I just haven't come across it yet at this point, but is that a part of this story as well?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we learned in that first summer of the pilot project was we had lots of data about escapements and so forth, but we really didn't know the rivers like the individual tribal biologists knew who were on that river every day. So one of the great advantages of bringing the managers together was that we started to A, share data, and B, rely on the local experts more for their day-to-day efforts on the river versus our week-to-week effort on the rivers, right. That kind of thing. So I don't know, most of the biologists that I worked with are long gone and retired like me. So I don't know the individual biologists for either side anymore. I met a few at the celebrations, but I don't know them. But what I do know is that we found out very quickly that the Lummi biologists brought a lot to the table when it came to the San Juan fisheries. They had data that we didn't have. We had data that they didn't have. Again, once we started sharing that data, we all became better managers. Yeah. Now, some of them didn't like it having to do that, but they did do it. And we found the same thing, by the way, in working with the federal scientists out in the ocean fisheries management, which again are federal waters. You know, we basically had 2 or 3 biologists that were really expert on the ocean management. There was no way they knew what the impact of a particular fishery in the ocean was going to have on mixed stock fisheries that returned to individual rivers. So to me, it became so clear that if we were doing this thing together, just like when we went to go to U.S.-Canada meetings, and I was on the Salmon Commission for 3 years after I left the Fisheries Department. And the fact that we had that local knowledge added to the mix of data collection, which was largely tribes in our state, we were better managers. So once we developed some level of respect for one another, I think I haven't heard a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is a bad thing that the tribes are involved," you know, because they bring a lot to the dance, a lot of technical knowledge and knowledge about their river systems that there was no way a state biologist sitting in Olympia or even in one of the field offices could bring to the table. So we expanded the tent, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate you filling in some of the gaps for me there and learning more about that aspect of it. One of the other things that really I think is a very impressive about the whole situation is just a broad scope of activities that unfolded after that pilot project that you referred to, because I'm sure I'll miss a few things here now, but there was the early days of managing the seasonal fisheries. There was the El Nino crisis that you referenced in your book. There was the two different treaty negotiations when you think about it, because the first one didn't quite make it. The second one got across the finish line. And then there was the shared negotiations against the utilities, the forest and timber industry negotiations. Yep. Like, it was such a broad scope of negotiations that all of a sudden the state and the tribes were working together on, that it's really blossomed into much more than what most people would see as fish management, so to speak, right?
Well, I'll tell you who gets credit for that is Billy. Billy started talking about fish habitat in about 1982 or 83. And I had a fish habitat division in my department, but it largely focused on Columbia River issues. And it wasn't focused on timberland harvest or agricultural water use or any of those things. And quite frankly, I had almost no statutory authority to focus on those things. We were largely a fish production and fish management agency. And it turned out that most of my career I spent negotiating fish habitat issues on behalf of different clients. And again, Jim Waldo and I formed a partnership in a firm in Tacoma in the late 1980s after I had served my stint working on the budget for Governor Gardner, budget and taxes. And we formed a natural resources practice group within our firm. And we largely I thought I was going to kind of ease my way back into some fish management issues. Never got there because habitat had become, because of Billy Frank, the focus of what people had to really start taking care of. And because of the ORIC decision, the tribes had authority when it came to fish habitat that the state really couldn't match, except from a water quality and air quality standpoint, for example. And they became incredibly important for people like the timber industry and the PUDs and people with dams and people who are controlling water management and so forth. And so we ended up facilitating a lot of agreements over the rest of my career and Jim's career in the water resource area and in the fish habitat area. And it was a wonderful, wonderful career. And it kept me in touch with Billy and Tim Wapato and many other tribal leaders. And we found a lot of things that we could work together on. But the Indian treaty rights and that so-called phase 2 part of the litigation that basically found that the tribes were entitled to have the habitat protected. Otherwise, the fish would dwindle down to zero, and their treaty rights needed to be protected. And they used that leverage quite well, and still do. They got the culvert case. They got all sorts of different things done that are leading to habitat improvements throughout our state. So one of the questions that was asked at the conference was, are we better off today having the Boldt decision having been decided the way it was, or are we not? And I answered that in the affirmative. One of my successors, Phil Anderson, who was a fisheries director in I think from 2007 to 2017, answered it the same way I did. And the current fisheries director all answered that the Boldt decision was the best thing that ever happened to the fish. And it has made the fish relevant for all of these years. And so, either the three of us are out of our minds or we're right. And I tend to think that we were right about that. We made some hard calls. They made some hard calls. They could have been a lot more popular, probably not making those calls, but they're still making them. And so are the tribes.
It's hard to imagine ever having got to co-management without that necessary court action and
No.
all. I don't know if it would have ever got there otherwise. And when you think about all of the negotiations and all of the successes, are there any kind of tweaks or things you might have done differently along the way now, or any insights?
Well, that's a really good question. Of course, there were individual moments where I could have handled myself better, but I can tell you this, it was an honor to even be included in those situations. And you asked me a few weeks ago, is it even possible in the way politics are going? It was not possible when we did it. Most of the hard things that get done in this life, they require leadership. And leadership comes in so many different packages, okay? But the bottom line is that, and I have people telling me, oh, you'll never get this done with the Democrats and the Republicans fighting. Well, they were fighting each other in our era, and they disagreed vehemently with each other in our era. But we were lucky. There were some leaders that came out that led us in a different direction. But the formula still exists. And Biden said in the last election, yeah, the Congress fights itself every day. I was there 40 years. We fought every day. But coming to an agreement is a choice. It's a choice. And I think it's the job of us as citizens to make sure that our leaders make choices. And that's what co-management sets up the opportunity for. And I don't know a lot about what's going on now, but I do know that if you make the choice to work together, you're much more likely to be successful than if you make the choice the other direction.
I really like your point you made there. It reminds me of a podcast I did recently with some co-management colleagues on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, where they have a lot of different tribes as well. And they were describing co-management more as an attitude than anything. And if people want to make the choice, like you say, to come together and work things out, some good things are possible. And maybe that would be a good question to end on. And thank you for being so generous with your time. Is for the critics, I guess, that are out there of co-management, what would you say to try to counteract sometimes people that are still not convinced?
Well, take a look at the record. My counter is, in fact, I have some very dear friends that think co-management doesn't work. And all I say to them is, so you go back to what? You go back to court management? You go back to just letting the politicians run rampant over the scientists, or vice versa? You go to your little office in Olympia and you ignore what's going on everywhere else? Show me a better idea. And that's exactly in part of the book I wrote about the Power Act. and Scoop Jackson, Senator Henry M. Jackson, telling everybody, you're not going to get a bill through the Congress unless you work with these guys. And by these guys, that meant the tribes and the fish agencies. I can tell you right now, you won't get a bill out of the House if you can't do that. So you have a choice, but one of them doesn't get you a bill. And he said that you have to have a better idea to change courses. So when I hear people, and I get lectured, not very much anymore because I'm old man, but when they say, well, it just doesn't work. Really? Well, then tell me what will work. Give me a better idea. Because that's what the political leaders told us. And John Spellman told me, Bill, tell me what you can do better and I'll listen. And we came in with the idea of managing with the tribes. And he thought that was a better idea. And he had the courage to do it. Well, that's what I say to my friends that disagree with me. I just say, tell me what your idea is.
No, that's great. And you can trust your friends to tell you what's on their
That's
mind.
right.
So those are kind of fun spaces
I agree with you. I agree.
Well, let me just say I'm very grateful for your time and certainly respectful of the public service that you have done over your career, and putting in a book in the way that you have is very instructive, because people like myself who are involved in co-management but on the outside of government, I would say, or a little bit on the intersection, we don't always have the insights or the appreciation for what's going on the other side, and to have such a first person account like you shared in a co-management evolution that couldn't have really been much more challenging if you tried is certainly a case study that I've been sharing with people and saying, well, if you don't think we can do it, well, maybe you should read a little bit about what others have been able to make their way through. So I really appreciate that. And I know the Boldt decision and the work in Washington has had ripple effects in Canada as well. So thank you. And
I've really enjoyed it, Jamie. And I was shocked when you sent me your first deal. I really appreciate the fact that you read the book. And I can tell you, I'm not an author. I was built for doing the work much more than I was for writing about the work. But it was an experience, a second experience of a lifetime to do the research and remember this time, because I truly believe human beings have the capacity to do good things. I didn't write a how to do it. I wrote it was done, and here's how it was done book. And Charles Wilkerson wrote a broader story than the one that I wrote. And John Hughes just did his book, the legacy book that you were describing, about the judge himself. So there's a lot of new information out there about how certain people did it. Now, everybody else is going to do it differently. The key advice that I offer people when they ask me is make your choices and then go do it, and I can tell you from experience, if you want to serve the public right now, saving the fish and saving fish habitat is a big part of our environmental challenge in the coming years. And you better figure out a way to do it with people as opposed to doing it your own way, because not many people get very far doing this on their own. They've got to find a co in the co-management deal. And whether you believe we did the right thing or not, hire people that are interested in doing the right thing, I guess is the way to put it. And then hopefully they'll read and learn a lot about how to do it. But I know I had to.
I think that was the final word right there. I won't add anything else to the podcast. I'll stop it right at what you just said right there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Cloudberry Connections. Each episode is engineered by Spencer Thompson, and we strive to keep making each episode better and more entertaining. But at the heart of this podcast, we really value the quality of our guests and all the expertise, knowledge that they have been willing to share. Please also visit comanagement.ca, where we continue to compile as many open access resources as possible about co-management in Canada. And until the next time we're together, please stay safe in peace and friendship. And remember that we are all treaty people in Canada, and we can all have an impact in reconciliation. Take care.